Hey everyone, welcome to part two on oniric consciousness or on dream consciousness. What we're going to do here is briefly describe the neurodynamics of dreams on an introductory basis, of course. Generally, there are three main scales on which or in which neural analysis is conducted. The first scale is microscopic, second scale is mesoscopic, and the third scale is macroscopic. The microscopic scale has to do with the internal structure of neurons. The internal structure meaning the actual organelles that compose the neurons, the neurotransmitters that are exchanged by neurons, and so forth. The mesoscopic scale has to do with the synaptic and network assemblies that are formed between neurons. The macroscopic scale, perhaps the most interesting scale in a sense, is composed of larger scale network subassemblies, entire brain regions and lobes and gyri that have to do with phase coordination, or we can say synchronization, that occur at different frequencies, which we call brain waves. Meaning entire millions, if not billions of neurons are synchronized in their electrical activity, which is what is happening in my brain right now, which is what permits me to speak and sense the computer and all these things, which is what allows you to register my voice in sequence and process the information carried by these verbal symbols that are strung together and form sentences which you convert into different emotional and conceptual patterns. This is what we're doing all the time. What we tend to do is think that, in a reductionistic perspective, that the microscopic, mesoscopic, and macroscopic scales influence each other from the bottom up. This is not quite correct. As we should know, self-dual structure and teleodynamics are both bottom up in an executive sense and top down in a programmatic sense. So both top-down programs and bottom-up emergent structures are feeding back on each other in a way that we've explained, again, on an introductory basis in different videos. And we'll continue to explain this in the upcoming presentations. But once again, you've got microscopic scale, internal neural structure, and neurotransmitter structure. And of course, you have microscopic neurodynamics, neural structure, and neurodynamics, which is, properly speaking, of a lower order complexity and involves lower order entanglements that are more crowded together in space-time. Okay, you've got mesoscopic structure, which has to do with synaptic and smaller network connections, which are typically on the subassembly below large assemblies. And then you have macroscopic structure, which is, once again, when you have neural oscillations or synchronizations, phase coordinations, a few terms for this, which occur at certain frequencies called brainwaves, which go from delta, which is the lowest frequency, occurring in so-called non-REM sleep, and gamma, based on scans of meditators and people who are accessing states of consciousness, which we would associate with extremely high frequency neural oscillation. Now, there's a debate as to how these different frequencies of neural oscillation or brainwaves interact. They seem to interact in rather interesting ways, but we're not going to get into that yet. The reason why we introduce you to this is because most of us assume, or at least most of us who are materially anchored assume, that all of consciousness and intelligence are internal to the brain, internal to the skull, internal to the body. This is, strictly speaking, incorrect. That is a terminal confinement of self-dual structure. Self-dual structure mandates that physical structure, relational structure, and operational structure, namely, in other words, elemental structure, okay, which is physical structure. Every single element has to be in some sense a terminal element, even if its referent is a terminal symbol, such as the symbol 1, or a variable symbol, or something, an auxiliary symbol. Relational structure has to do with predicate level structure, meaning how do properties interact with each other on the basis of terminal elements. And Operational structure has to do with how properties and elements evolve, not just in linear time, but in linear nonlinear time, where nonlinear time is not merely time symmetry in a quantum theoretic sense, goes beyond that. And we'll also get into that. How we have a new kind of programming which generalizes hypercomputation, because even hypercomputation assumes a linearization of infinity. Anyway, let's not get into that yet. Elemental, relational, and operational levels of structure are required to define any dynamics. So that would include neurodynamics. That would include the neurodynamics of dreaming, which means that if you assume that when I'm perceiving something outside of my face, really what I'm perceiving is being internally simulated inside of my face, inside of my skull, is incorrect. Okay, that's a very tricky assumption. That's a very tricky assumption, and it's a tricky pitfall, but we shouldn't fall for it. Okay, it's very easy to fall for it if you become reductionist and materialist, whereas if you're an idealist, then you would basically say that terminal elements are illusory and don't really exist, which is also false. We need to unite materialism and idealism, which is what we need to self-dualize them. Okay, now, when you self-dualize material and ideal levels of structure, the ideal level of structure only focuses on relational structure, okay, as in the relational interpretation of quantum mechanics, for example. And material structure only focuses on the actual terminal elements, the physical objects. And everything else is secondary, right? And in some sense illusory, meaning it's generated by the terminal elements and exists only for the terminal elements, or the bodies. When we self-dualize them, we introduce true operational structure, meaning we introduce the actual dynamics of structure. Normally we disjoin structure and dynamics, right? Self-dual structure includes teleodynamics as operational structure, okay? And teleodynamics requires self-dual structure to even be stable. Otherwise, there would be no dynamics. If dynamics was truly randomized, then that would amount to structurelessness, which is unidentifiable, meaning non-existent. There is no such thing as a truly random process. We can talk about mixing levels of randomness and saying, well, if I roll a die in a game of Monopoly and I want to get a 5 through 6, but you know the dynamics of the die have nothing to do with my goal to get a 5 or a 6 with respect to the rules of the game, or with respect to some strategy or another player's strategy. When we mix levels like that, that's where we generate randomness. But that's a misunderstanding of randomness. Randomness taken literally means structurelessness. So let's also get that straight. Okay. Now, when we introduce self-dual structure and teleodynamics, meaning utility-driven dynamics, then we can start to understand that what we're perceiving is, well, let's just take a simple example. I'm perceiving a monitor. I'm perceiving the room around me, right? Every single terminal element is instantiating different properties, different predicates, creating a relational level of structure. You cannot define terminal elements without relational structure. Even if you have just a single terminal element, you need to distinguish that terminal element from its complement, meaning there's relational structure, meaning two-valued structure, it's extremely elementary, between the terminal element and the complement. Otherwise, there is no terminal element identifiable and you have structurelessness, which again is synonymous with non-existence. When I'm perceiving a room, my body is a composite terminal element. The room is a composite terminal element. The relational structure is very, very deep. And it actually involves higher order entanglements. Entanglements that go beyond, quantum mechanical entanglement, beyond chemical entanglement, even beyond biological entanglement, up to psychological entanglement. I can perceive a room that I haven't perceived in years and experience emotions that have not been experienced and will not be experienced unless I'm in that exact room, namely my childhood room where I was traumatized, let's say, right? Just speaking hypothetically. Something you will not remember certain aspects of your childhood unless you step into your childhood abode. And that means that there is an entanglement between the two terminal elements, the abode and you. And that entanglement carries information. Usually we think, oh, entanglement doesn't carry any information. It's just correlational. That's quantum mechanical entanglement. Okay? That is near random entanglement, right? But there are other forms of entanglement that do carry information, right? And that just means we have to define entanglement on coherence. When there is a coherent relation or coherent relational structure between two terminal elements, that counts as an entanglement. But here, in mathematical metaphysics, which is the discipline that we use here, the entanglement is between an adjoint axiom, an adjoint theorem, or let's just simplify, an axiom, a theorem, which is bridged by some operation. Okay, the axiom could be a source, the theorem could be a target, the operation could be as simple as an identity relation, or identity operation. Which means that there is no such relation that is not an entanglement in our sense. Usually we think of entanglement as something that is a spooky aspect of quantum mechanics that only involves quantum mechanical coherence. No, quantum mechanical coherence is not the only kind of coherence. Any relational structure held between two or more terminal elements, namely physical objects, is an entanglement in this generalized mathematical context. Now, when I walk into my childhood abode or my childhood room and I perceive an old wardrobe, or I just walk into the room and the knowledge that I'm in that room, the sheer presence of that room induces on me a flood of memories that were somehow inaccessible. I can then understand that there is a higher order form of entanglement which is now being recognized or syntactically processed in the context of neural oscillations. Those neural oscillations are not confined to my brain. The neural oscillations are an aspect of that entanglement. They're a physical aspect of that entanglement. Okay? It's the physical aspect of a structural relation between myself and the room. And the operation that is carrying that structural relation into physical instantiation, meaning into the actual neural oscillations that correlate, we say, with our memory, or with my memory, would be teleodynamical, meaning that it's utility seeking. Okay? If something, and of course this is where things get very hairy because utility can be mixed among levels and there can be violations of utility on one level which are actually quite beneficial on another level, right? Which goes into things like catalysts and negative events which seem to work against us but actually are being programmed from higher levels of syntax and things like that, right? We mentioned in the first video that there are 4 strata of syntax: physical, structural, perceptual, and emotional. Technically, the emotional level is the densest because it doesn't require any physical, it doesn't require strict physical instantiation. Emotions can be instantiated in the most diverse of fashions, whereas physical syntax is something that we can study in terms of physics and chemistry and biology, where we begin with terminal elements and then we say, okay, those are what exist, and human theorists are discerning properties, namely structural relations between them, but those structural relations are inside of our head and are native to the theorist and don't really exist anywhere in nature. Those are just tools of understanding these physical objects, which is what really exists. And yes, the physical objects are undergoing dynamics, but those dynamics are being filtered by our own neurodynamics. Okay? And therefore, we can't really understand the dynamics that we perceive as anything other than a reflection of our own neurodynamics, which creates an opacity. Okay? Now, let me stabilize here. When we're dreaming, a lot of us think, well, it's just happening in our brain. That's, according to self-dual structure and teleodynamics, it cannot just be happening in our brain. It has to, of course, we have sensory deprivation in a sense. We're not receiving physical inputs. We're not receiving sensory inputs when we're dreaming. right? I mean, the body is still to some extent able to call on those sensory inputs, which is why you can be woken up by loud noises and people touching you and light changes and things like that, right? But primarily, we are not, we are sort of enclosed or insulated, which means, and this is the purpose of this video, is to introduce this concept of, I was going to say semi-embodied, but really what we mean is multi-embodied entanglement. Right now, we're singly embodied. We have a single body in terms of which our entire incarnation is instantiated, and in terms of which we experience our emotions and our thoughts and our actions. When we are dreaming, we have a chance to experience multiple types of body. When I say multiple types of body, yes, they can be conventional bodies like cells and insects and planets, but they can also be denser bodies that we have not yet recognized and cannot easily perceive. They can be light-like bodies, other bodies which are still bodies but are not as localistic or as linear in their dynamics. Multi-embodied entanglement is what we perceive, what we experience when we're dreaming, unless we are lucid dreaming, or unless we're, well, there's two types of terminally approximated dreams. Lucid dreaming, when you're self-conscious that you're dreaming, but you're still, in a sense, a human or a single body. You could be an animal body, but you're still a single body. When you are not lucid, but you are dreaming in a way that is akin to your terminal awareness, your terminal consciousness, you are also terminally approximating your waking life. When you are not lucid and not dreaming in a terminally approximated way, you are experiencing multi-body entanglement. Meaning you're able to experience structural relations and operations without being confined to a single body. And that would include having an atmospheric or a plasmatic body, which allows for a plasmatic or panoramic perception, which can then localize as necessary given certain bodies. And of course, when we start getting into DMT-like dreams, we start getting into denser light-like bodies, higher order photonic bodies that we'll talk about, which can instantiate themselves in multiple bodies and transfigure without losing coherence, without actually falling into lower order coherence and basically losing the plot and not understanding what is happening. Now, the majority of my childhood and adolescent dream states were experiencing multi-body entanglement where through a denser type of body, as we just mentioned, but consistently losing coherence and not realizing how these substitutions between bodies are happening and why they're happening, how there is information being carried, how the state transitions are actually multi-body transitions. The transitions between bodies are what are actually carrying the information and the communication of the dream. This is high-level dream analysis. This is high-level dream experience. And I'll be discussing how in the last, say, 5 or so years, I'm approaching 31 now, just for reference, I've been able to gradually grasp not only multi-body entanglement, but multi-body entanglement guided by a denser intelligence, which instantiates itself via a denser body complex, a higher order photonic body complex, as I mentioned. Very exciting. I'm very excited to share. I'm sure a lot of us have been doing this, and we'll see you soon. Thank you for listening.